So we're going to say Shalom Aleichem. Welcome everybody to our second of the four sequence Navi class on biblical personalities in leadership. I did get to watch most of your videos. I'm working on the response, so we should be getting them, God willing, sometime now. But I would like to go, last time we talked about what a model of leadership would look like through the lens of Moshe Rabbeinu. I want to take you to the other extreme. I want to examine what does it look like when there is a failure of leadership? What happens when leadership is corrupt, weak, inept, and ultimately, what does anarchy look like? Right? It's very easy for us to put under the microscope, well, this leader's horrible, and this one we do like, this one we don't like, this policy. That's nice because we have leadership. What happens in a leaderless world? What happens when anarchy reigns? What does it look like? What are its causes? What are its symptoms? And then, is there a purpose that anarchy may or may not serve in proper and powerful leadership? So that's the lens I want to focus on today. If we can, open up to Shoftim. So if you recall, we touched a little bit on Shoftim. Tell me about the time period of Shoftim, the judges. What is it marked by or not marked by? Okay, let me give you context. So this is after Yehoshua dies, right? He leads the Jewish people into the land of Israel, starts the conquest of the land, does not complete it. Once he dies, we have a period known as the Shoftim. What are the judges? If you look at, we're going to look at Shoftim Yud Zayin, so the 17th chapter, Pasuk Vav. Tell me what you know about the time period of the Shoftim. Do we know anything about the Shoftim?
There was no king and everyone did as they pleased, is what the Parya says.
Yeah, Femo, that's exactly the pasuk we're going with. There was no centralized authority, and everybody did what they wanted. We know that there were, I believe it's about 40 different leaders, right? So we start with Otniel ben Kenaz, Ehud ben Gera, we have Yiftach HaGiladi, we have Devorah, we talked about Shimshon HaGibor. There are marked leaders, yes, who doubled over not just as government authorities, but also actually judges. However, if you look at the beginning of Sefer Shoftim, it's very clear that the Jewish people are now going through a very, very chaotic time period where it's cyclical. So the Jewish people, it says the generation of Yehoshua dies, and all the people who had gone in with him, experienced the miracles, experienced the fervor of what it means to be a nation, to be conquering our own land. And that generation dies out. The Jews are then racked with years and years and years where the Jewish people go through the cycle of, we don't know who HaKadosh Baruch Hu is. We start worshiping the idols. We start doing what the cool kids on the block are doing. So our neighbors, setting up idols, worshiping idols, doing evil things. And we'll see in a minute how idol worship always is in conjunction with the Jews doing bad things. In fact, our Chachamim tell us that Lo Avdu Avodah Zara, the Jews never worshipped Avodah Zara, unless what? Ela la'atir lahem arayot. Unless it was to bring some kind of sexual promiscuity that they wanted to do under the guise of, well, our new gods let us. That's generally what you find. In fact, in this week's Parshat HaShavua, you find Parshat Ki Tisa, yes, where the Jewish people create an idol and immediately leads to sexual immorality. Something, a different conversation for another time, why it always is that we need to find a different God to do the bad things that we want to do. The cycle continues. Hashem sends a common enemy. The Jewish people start doing teshuvah. They fight. Hashem sends a leader, usually one of the judges. They successfully win the war, and then the cycle continues over. Vayishman, Yishorun, Vayivat, the Jewish people, they become fat. They become satisfied. They forget about HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And this cycle continues on and on and on and on. We find the entire Shoftim is marked with all this chaos, up until we find really Shemuel Aleph, where we start with Eli HaKohen, his sons who unfortunately do not follow in his path and are just as corrupt, Shmuel HaNavi, and then the dynasties of the kings. If you look at Pasuk Yud Zayin, though, so it's a Perek Yud Zayin, Pasuk Vav of Shoftim. So this is going to be the famous story of the Pesel Micha. By show of hands, how many of you are familiar with the idol of Micha? Okay, So let's look at that story. Bayamim Ahem, in those days, yes, in the times of the Shoftim, En Melech BiYisrael, there was no king in the Jewish people, meaning there's no centralized authority. There is no centralized leadership that dictates what the Jewish people do, what happens if they don't do. We know in Parshat Shoftim, it says, Shoftim v'shotrim titen lecha b'chol sha'arecha. You can't just have a judicial system if you don't have anybody to execute the laws. We're living in a time period, En Melech BiYisrael, there is no king, Eish hayashar be'enav yaseh. So ultimately what happens when there's a vacuum of power, everybody does whatever they see to be right and just. Anarchy. When there is no centralized authority, everybody who decides, I have my way of doing things, you have your way, and there's nobody who's going to not just penalize me for doing it, but there's nobody to dictate that it's even wrong. It's anarchy. And here you have a very interesting story that I'm going to tell you. I would recommend you read it. But you have a guy by the name of Micha, actually his mother, okay? Men and their mothers. I don't know, Freud was onto something. His mother seems to have lost a significant amount of money. Micha brings the money back to her. The commentaries are divided. Did he steal it, or was he the third party who returned it? Ultimately, his mother says, I really want you to set up a pesel. I want you to make this beautiful idol for our house, and it's going to be somewhere that we can worship. Now, are Jewish people allowed to make houses of idol worship? No, especially this is happening in Bet Lechem. It's happening in Har Ephraim, which ultimately then becomes part of Dan. So you ever hear the expression from Dan till Be'er Sheva? This will always become problematic. Why? Because the centralized power is always being fought over. Is the capital of Jerusalem? Is it going to be in Shevet Dan and that whole region north? You find over here that this is the first time where, though there's a Mishkan in Shiloh, the mother of Micha says, no, I want to set up something else. I'm setting up something independent. They end up snagging a little Levi off the street, and they say, come, we're going to compensate you. How much money should we pay you? We'll feed you, we'll clothe you. You just become the puppet that we need, because now you're going to be the new Kohen. You're going to be the new Kohen. You're going to help us do the service. You're going to help us worship. In a very strange twist, you then have, so this Pesel, known as Pesel Micha, is set up. And then there's a group that comes from the Jewish people. So this group is from Shevet Dan. They're coming trying to conquer land. Why? Because we know that Yehoshua, unfortunately, didn't have the opportunity to finish the conquest of the land. So Yehoshua dies and Shevet Dan is still left without a portion to settle down on. They see this as a very opportune time. And as they're passing through the city of Micha, they say, hey, we know you. What are you doing here? They talk to the Levi, and he says, me? I'm up for hire, right? I'm a priest for hiring. I said, what do you mean? He said, come, I'll show you. There's a big avodah zarah. There's a big statue. There's a bunch of accessories that come along with it. So this group from Shevet Dan goes, and they steal the god of Micha, right? This huge avodah zarah, and they claim it as theirs. And when Micha comes running after them and says, excuse me, you can't steal my god. You can't steal my idol that I built with my money. They tell him, shh, just be quiet. Because if you're going to make a ruckus and if you're going to make noise, the surrounding neighbors are going to come and they're going to attack you, not us. We're not worried. We're here as a group. You, who are you? You're an individual trying to fight a gang. Now you have to understand the absurdity of this story. It's not like they came in and they stole some nice pottery from him, right? It's not like they came to his field and they said, oh, wow, there's so many good crops, let me steal it. What are they stealing? They're stealing a very religious item. Yeah, it's a holy war. It's not that they're coming and they're taking away just a possession. They're coming and stealing something that both of them clearly think has religious significance. They claim it as their own. They then set it up in their own territory, and it's known as Pesel Micha. This is an idol that for generations the Jewish people worshipped. So that's the first story you have over here, where the Navi tells us there is no centralized authority, and a direct result of this anarchy is religious corruption. It's not just religious corruption, but it's force, it's brute, it's murder, it's pain, all in the name of who? All in the name of God. If you're familiar with anything about the Crusaders, right? You remember the Crusades starting year 1096 with a famous speech. I believe it was Pope Pius II, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know if 1096 was maybe the second crusade, where he famously gets up, and again, we know the Crusaders were on holy wars, right? These were holy wars to go from Western Europe all the way east to Jerusalem to recapture it, right, from the Muslim leadership, from the Ottomans. From the Seljuk Turks at that point. So this is the predecessors of the Ottomans. And the danger, if you ever bump into, whether it's jihadists, whether it's crusaders, they're always fighting in the name of God. And it's amazing because in the name of peace and love and religion, how much bloodshed has been really spilled throughout the years. And the Jews, unfortunately, also have a history of such bloodshed. We're looking at a religious fervor that is not just left unchecked, but becomes extremely corrupt because there's no centralized authority saying, no, these are the laws. This is how things are supposed to be. This is the way things are not supposed to be. This is not right. So that's the story with the Pesel Micha. If you go to Shoftim Chaf Aleph, so move a few chapters over. I don't have the heart to read the story out loud. I'm being honest. So I'm not going to. I'm going to recommend you read it on your own and do your own research. But it's an important story, so I'm not going to skip it. If you look at Shoftim Chaf Aleph, look at Pasuk Chaf He. You'll notice this is a parallel of words. So this is after the story of Micha. They stole his idols. Bayamim Hahem, in those days, again, in the days of the Shoftim, En Melech b'Yisrael, there is no king in the Jewish people. Don't get stuck on the word king. Translate, there is no centralized authority. There is no centralized government. Ish hayashar be'enav yaseh. Everybody does what's good and right in their own eyes. What then follows before this sentence, if you look at the whole Shoftim, starting with chapter 19, all the way till where I just read, is the famous story of Pilegesh B'Giva, the concubine in the Giva. Are any of you familiar with that story? Okay. I'm going to give you a brief synopsis of the story. I honestly recommend on your own time, read this story. Make sure you have a tissue box near you. Every single time I read it, it's so gut-wrenching. It will boggle your mind that something like this could happen. The synopsis is, there's a guy who takes a wife, and seemingly the wife is not happy. She runs back home to her parents. She runs back home. He goes to his father-in-law's house, and he tries to encourage her and convince her to come back. And the father-in-law invites him in for 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. And every day they sit down, and you have to understand the context. This is very Middle Eastern. I know Jews think they're European. We're not. We happen to have been exiled to there. But this, I always tell my husband when he comes to my house. So for those of you who are not familiar, my family's Ashkenazi. So when he comes to my house, my mother says, do you want something to eat? And if he answers no, I tell him, you're going to starve. Nobody's going to ask you for the next 7 days if you want anything. If you want, you have to be honest the first time. If you don't want, try that in a Middle Eastern house. Do you know how rude it is on the first time to say yes if somebody asks you if you want food? The answer, of course, is going to be no, I just ate at home, I'm not hungry, I only came for 5 minutes. We know, by the way, this is across the board a Middle Eastern character trait. It's only the Persians have a word for it called tarof. It's a game. It's a dance, right? Things are, you don't just barge in. I remember when we got married, the first time I went to visit my parents, after we were married about, 9, 10 months, a little bit in, my mother came to me and she said, Devorah, are you happy? I said, yeah, of course. Why are you asking? She said, because you don't stop hugging and kissing me and touching me. What do you want? I said, I forgot. I forgot now that I'm in your house and not my mother-in-law's house. Because in the world I come from, people don't really hug and kiss and touch. That's reserved for either very happy occasions or very sad occasions. For sure, not every 5 minutes. But my mother-in-law, if we don't say hello and we kiss each other on both cheeks, are we fighting? Are we angry? And the answer is no, of course not. These are two different cultures. Yes. I remember on that same trip, my husband, he ate something and he was not feeling well. Now, I happened to have that morning, forgive me, I had planned a trip with my sister, and I said, I'm not canceling. Now, 10 years later, I'd be wiser. I probably would have not just left him there alone. But I said, I'm going on my day trip, and I left him with whatever he needed, some Tylenol, and I come back about 10 hours later, and I go into the house. Now, he's in my parents' house. The lights are all off. I come in, my mother says, shh, Yonathan's sleeping. I come into his room. I said, how you feeling? He said, me? I'm almost dying. I said, why? He said, it's been 10 hours since you're gone, and not one person knocked on my door to say, hi, how are you? Do you need something to eat? Do you need a pillow? Do you need... I come out of the room, and my mother says to me, because he was sick today, we made sure the house was quiet. Nobody came near his door. Nobody bothered him. Nobody knocked. We didn't do anything so we would disturb him. And then we realized that culture plays a tremendous role in relationships. Because what you interpret as love, for the other person is, please, you're suffocating me to death. And what you think is, I'm being respectful of your space and your time, to the other person feels like, what am I, a dog? What are you treating me like, a stranger? So you have to read the Tanakh like Jews. The father-in-law keeps telling him, okay, you know what, I know, fine, you want to leave, no problem. Come have breakfast. But breakfast doesn't take 5 minutes. So the son-in-law says, no, I really want to leave. I don't want to eat. I'm not hungry. No, come. This happens 5 days in a row, that by the time they finish eating, the father-in-law says, look, it's already past midday. If you're going to leave now, you're going to get stuck in the middle of the road. It's not like today where there are a bunch of hotels. Where are you going to stay? Where are you going to sleep? Stay till tomorrow. And he falls for this trick 5 days in a row until the next day, the 6th day, he said, I'm leaving. Don't even ask me about breakfast. I'm not staying for breakfast. And of course, 6 days in, I'm sure the father-in-law was offended. Turns out he leaves midday because he does stay for breakfast. And they hit the road, and unfortunately, it gets dark before they reach their destination. The story only gets worse from there. They're sitting in the middle of the road, and they're not poor people. So they have food, they have donkeys, they have everything they need. And an older man passes them and says, you're not in a safe city. I don't want you to stay out here alone in the streets. Come to me. And the young man says, no, I'm okay. I'm really just passing through the city. I'm going home for the night. The old man says, no, come to my house. The streets aren't safe. He brings him home. The stories that we know about Sodom and Amorah don't compare to the stories of what the Jewish people do now. They come to the door of the old man, and they bang the door down, and they say, we saw a young gentleman over there. We want him. Give him to us so we can rape him. Give him to us so that we can do the worst of the Averot. And ultimately, the old man says no. And they end up sending out the Pilegesh instead, the young woman. And what happens to her, again, I would recommend you read it inside. By the time the night is over, the amount of abuse that she goes through and humiliation, they end up depositing her back at the doorstep. And when her husband comes out and he tries to wake her up, he realizes they killed her. So after all the gang rape and the pain and the suffering and the abuse, she's dead. And he ends up taking her home. And he ends up, again, you're going to read this story. This ends up leading to a massive civil war in the Jewish people, because the question is, how in the world did the Jewish people get here? How in the world could it be? You're looking at this story, and just when you think it can't get more absurd, just when you think it can't get more corrupt, it keeps going. And this ends up leading to bloodshed, where brothers literally leads to a civil war with the tribe of Binyamin. Because the retaliation of how in the world did you take a Jewish daughter and defile her like that? How could it be that you came to two innocent people? Very simple, because there was anarchy. Because there was no centralized leadership. Because there was no law. Because there was nobody to say that if you do the wrong thing, you're going to pay the price for it. There was nobody who said, but these are the rules of the town, and this is how we enforce it. And you see that it's not just, okay, so there's no leadership. It's when there's no centralized authority who has control of the people, We would like to think that the best of society comes out. It's true. But also the worst of humanity. And we find both with the Pesel Micha, as well as the story of the Pilegesh Begiva, the common theme is there's no king in the Jewish people. The Ish Hayashar Beinav Yaseh. And what happens? Anarchy. Everybody does whatever they see is good and right in their own eyes. The brutality, the ugliness. I know for some of us, at the beginning of COVID, if you remember, we saw something similar, which was there was almost a suspension of just time, law, everything. And there were videos that people kept on posting. Obviously, nothing like this case, where people were getting to real fights over what? Toilet paper. Remember those videos? Yes? Now, for the life of me, couldn't understand. If the world is like, if we're heading to an apocalypse and we're all going to die, I'm not sure why we need toilet paper. There was actually a study done psychologically, why in the world, from all the things are people fighting over toilet paper, okay? I recommend you read it. But there was a lot of conversation of, again, when there's chaos, when there's a vacuum of power, then suddenly you see, I saw a good quote the other week. It said, adversity doesn't build character. Adversity exposes character. So we always think that adversity makes you strong and it builds you into a better human. No. Adversity simply reveals the deep character inside. And sometimes it's the best of humanity. And unfortunately, sometimes it's the ugliest side of humanity. I want to back it up, though, because how did the Jewish people get to a place of anarchy? How is it that the Jewish people got to a place where it was a free-for-all? Everybody do whatever you want. You take the law into your own land. It doesn't happen from nowhere that people become anarchists. History is always needed to be studied in the context of what happened before, what happens after. Because if you look at it in the very, very narrow lens of today, it's usually really hard to understand what caused it. I want to look for a second with you in Megillat Ruth. If you can, look into Ketubim. Okay, so you're going to look at if you're on Safari, it's going to be under the title Writings. And you're going to look at Megillat Ruth. When do we normally read Megillat Ruth? Yeah, we normally read Megillat Ruth on Shavuot. Tell me who Ruth is. Who is she?
She was a Moabite.
Oh, she's Ruth HaMoaviyah. Very good. Who is she the mother or the grandmother of?
Great-grandmother of David.
Yafeh Mod. So Ruth is a convert. In today's society, she would never have gotten married, let alone her great-grandchild would have been made the king. But thankfully, there was once a world that didn't understand Judaism 101 of the 24th century. Kadosh Baruch Hu didn't get the memo that being a convert was a bad thing. Only the Jews of today knew that. You understand? I say that obviously in mockery. Okay? There's a reason that HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells us time and time again, be nice to the convert, be nice to the almanah, to the widow, be nice to the yitomim. Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu understood human nature. That for whatever reason, we pick on the vulnerable, we pick on the people who are different than us. And it doesn't feel good if I'm part of a country club where I do nothing for it, and then an outsider joins and they do more than me, it makes me feel bad. So the way I get rid of that bad feeling is not by doing better, it's by hating the person who joined. That is a symptom of a very ill Jewish community. But thankfully, in the times of Ruth, so if you look at the beginning, when does Ruth happen, right? When does this whole story take place with Ruth? Oh, very nice. If you look at the first psukim, yes? It says, Vayhi bimei shvot ha-shoftim. This story takes place when? In the times of the Shoftim. Vayhi rav ba'aretz, and there was a famine in the land. Vayelech ish mi bet lechem Yehuda. And this is when Elimelech goes with Naomi to live in the lands of Moab. Right? Why does he go? Very simply. There's a famine in Israel. Again, there's no centralized leadership to say, okay, so what happens when there's economic crisis? How do we plan for before and after? What is a social system? How do we set up a social welfare where the people who don't have, the people are struggling? What happens then? The answer is nothing. Everybody's on their own. So Elimelech makes the decision with his wife, why should I stick around? Right? I happen to have money. So Elimelech and Naomi happen to, yes, have money. They're from the wealthier people. But their decision was, why should we stick around? Ultimately, the burden's going to fall onto us. And if the burden falls onto us, I don't want to be the one who takes care now of all the socioeconomic problems. So let me leave. Yeah. If you look at, go into the Gemara. So for those of you who would like, otherwise you can listen. If you go into the Gemara, it's Mesechet Bava Batra, and it's going to be Tet Vav. So it's going to be 15b. If you look all the way at the end, I'm going to read, quote, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Sorry, you're going to see Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Go to the second one where he says, Va'amar Rabbi Yochanan, the next thing that he says. Mai dichtiv, he wants to understand, why does it say Vayihi? We know that in Hebrew literature, when you see the word Vayihi, it normally connotes something sad. So for example, we're coming up to Purim now. Tell me the opening verse of Megillat Esther. Yefé mod. Vayehi b'mei Achashverosh. And it was in the days of Achashverosh. And we know something sad is about to happen. So over here we have Vayehi b'mei Shifot HaShoftim. And it was in the days of the Shoftim, and the story continues. Rabbi Yochanan says, what was so sad? What was so tragic? He says, Oy lidor sheshofet et shoftav. Woe is to a generation that judges its judges. What does that mean? The judges themselves were so corrupt that if a judge would say, Omer lo, tul kisim mi bein einecha, if a judge would look at the constituents, the two people in front of them, and say, you know what? You have a splinter. Some say einecha, either between your eyes or between your teeth. Right? You have a little splinter over there. What would the defendants respond to the judge? Omer lo, tul kora mi bein einecha. You're telling me that I have a little splinter stuck between my eyes? I have a little splinter stuck between my teeth? You, judge, look into the mirror. You know what you have? You have a whole beam stuck between your eyes. You see, anarchy doesn't just come when things are going well. It's normally the solution, a poor solution, to a very corrupt institution. We're talking about a time period where if the defendants would look at the judges and the judges would critique them with something small, a splinter is tiny, right? It's annoying, it hurts, but it's something minor. It's a minor infraction. And the judge would say, you, look how awful you are. Look how bad you are. We're going to slam the book at you. We're going to throw the entire court system at you. The response of those in the court would say, hold on. Have you seen yourself? If you think I have a splinter in my teeth, you have a beam jutting out. The atrocities, the inequities, the disgusting things that you in the leadership position do doesn't compare to anything that I do. And that's unfortunately what you find, which is corrupt leadership directly leads to disillusioned constituents. When there's a government that instead of taking care of the people, steals from the people, lies to the people, hurts the people, the natural response of the people is, who needs you? Who needs you? If you're the ones who are meant to protect, to serve, to care, to be loyal, and you're everything but that, why should we pledge our allegiance? Now, you have a second kind of problem here. Not just corrupt leadership, but also weak leadership. So cruel leadership is very easy to say there's something wrong with. We don't always recognize that weakness is also just as deadly. Permissiveness, when there should be a set of rules, is deadly. When there are no boundaries, when people don't know clearly where things start and things end, when leadership is a free-for-all, it hurts the people that are the most vulnerable. Somebody once asked us why our community is so exclusive. Why it's a very particular type of person that either fits or doesn't. And we explained to them, sometimes there are communities that they want to be so broad and loving and accepting of everybody, and that's noble. But in trying to do that, they then really hurt all the other people. I'll give you an example. Somebody once asked, there was a community, not here, where there was somebody who had been convicted in court for abuse charges. And when they asked the rabbi, why are you letting this person pray in the synagogue? There are children around. This is somebody who's been convicted against crimes against children. So the rabbi's response is, yeah, but he also needs a place to pray. And whereas that's true, he does need a place to pray, it can't be in the place where there are other members who are directly being put in the line of fire because of your inability to put down boundaries. Often we think our permissive, you see, when somebody is strict, authoritative, we know there are clear boundaries, and sometimes that borders on tremendous corruption. Yes? They're too strict. They go from being authoritative to authoritarian to totalitarian governments, right? We know how totalitarian governments look. Just look at World War II, Italy, Russia. We don't have to go so far. Cuba, places in Korea, right? Authoritarian governments are not healthy. But the flip side is just as dangerous. Governments that really don't know how to take care of their constituents will always leave a vacuum of power, and that's always when the bullies take charge. That's always when the gangs run the country. That's always when the organized mafia takes over. Why? Because there wasn't an organized government to shut it down. There wasn't an organized institution to say, no, you can't operate like that. You can't. Think about it this way. My kids, I have one kid in particular. He always tells me that he hates when there's a substitute in school. Why? Because the teacher knows how to control the class. So for him, it gives him a very strong sense of stability. When the teacher walks in, everybody listens, everybody knows where they're supposed to go, which books they're supposed to have, when they could talk, how they're allowed to talk, what the process of leaving for the bathroom is. Comes a substitute, and it's chaotic. Because suddenly, the kids know better than the teacher. She doesn't know the rules. She doesn't know what's supposed to happen in the classroom. And there's this anxiety he always has, which is, I feel like I have to now be responsible for what's going on in the classroom. Because the person who's supposed to be big and in charge and making sure that everything's in order, they're not doing their job. And that's another form of corruption. One is the leader who is aggressive, cruel, mean, tyrannical. The other one, just as bad, permissive, has no laws, has no ability to enforce them, allows chaos to reign. I'd like to look for a minute in Pirkei Avot. So for those of you who have a Siddur, you can take it out. If you don't have a Siddur, that's okay. You can go on to Sefaria. Open up to Pirkei Avot Gimel, Pasuk Bet. And give me a minute so I can get myself a Siddur as well. Let me see if I can find one. Otherwise, I will read it to you. Let me see. Nope, I don't have a Siddur here, though I'm in a Bet Knesset. Can I ask somebody who does have? Open up to Pirkei Avot, Perek Gimel. Really, it's Mishnah. Perek Gimel, Mishnah Bet. Can you read to us what it says? Of course.
Nina, the vice high priest, said, pray for the welfare of the government, were it not for the fear it inspires, every man would swallow his neighbor alive.
Oh, that's it. Thank you. Yep. Thank you. It says we have to always pray that our governments should be peaceful. Why? It doesn't matter if you're on the far right or the far left or somewhere in the center or completely off the chart. It doesn't really matter. if there was no form of government, ish ed re'ehu, chayim bala'o. A man, now re'ehu means his friend, so we're not talking about enemies. Simply two people ultimately would self-destruct because there is no sense of order. Therefore, it's imperative on us to pray for the peace of the government, especially for the country that you're living in. So it doesn't matter if you have dual citizenship, and it doesn't matter if your heart lives somewhere else, right? Rabbi Yehuda Halevy, the famous poet and author of the Kuzari, who said, Ani b'mizrach v'libi b'sof ma'arav, right? I'm in the east. Libi b'mizrach v'ani b'sof ma'arav. The opposite. Libi b'mizrach, my heart is in the east, east being Jerusalem, but I live b'sof ma'arav. He ended up living in Spain. Many of us have that duality, which is I might live here, but my heart lives somewhere else. Okay, that's fine. But where you're living currently, it's imperative on you, on your community, to pray. Pray for the welfare of the government, for the welfare of the president, of the Congress, of the people who are running, even if you hate the government, but they're running the government. Because without them, the chaos that would ensue, people would eat each other alive. And it's a hard thing to think about. But we see this all the time. People who yesterday loved each other, throw in a financial dispute, throw in a territorial war, throw in a difference of ideologies, and you have never seen two friends become sworn enemies. So much so that if they could, and sometimes they do, they kill each other. The fact that there is a functional government. You know, this week we went to, on a whim, Rachel, Chana and Michael said, do you want to go with us to Tijuana? I said, yeah. So my husband was kind enough to indulge me, even though he never wants to go to Tijuana. He's like, why would I ever go to Ramallah? Exactly, I wouldn't. So then why am I going to Tijuana? I said, because I want to go. So we went. And you're literally 30 minutes from where we live. You're crossing into a whole new world. I once had the privilege to go, he should live and be well, with Rafael Goraye. Rafael Goraye is a Purple Heart from the Vietnam War, was part of our Bet Knesset, and then worked for Border Patrol for many, many years. He once took me and a couple of my Glitz girls. Trana, were you with us that year or was not you? Yep. So he took us on a trip to the border, actually. And we went, for those of you who've never been to the border, there's been a wall before the previous president. There's been a wall that's going to stay after. This whole talk about the wall, I'm not getting into the politics. Simply, I think that people who've never been to San Diego or to any border city don't know that this exists. Yes, in the United States, it exists. It has existed for a long time. In fact, under the current administration, they had added now, I saw coils on the top. That was something new. Chevra, every country has its boundaries and borders and its walls. Just because you haven't seen it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And just because Israel does it doesn't mean it's bad, right? There are a lot of narratives that are made up only by people who bank on the fact that most people don't fact check things. Because if they knew that we fact checked, a lot of the castles that people build in the air would not just fall. They didn't even exist. There was nothing to fall to begin with. So we went to the border, and it was very interesting because he was pointing out to us, firstly, there's a no man's zone. Okay, so there's territory between the United States, there's one wall. In Mexico, there's one wall, and then there's in-between space. And in between, there's a tremendous amount of garbage that was thrown there. And we asked him what it was, and he said, you know, a lot of the cities on the border, unfortunately, are not run by the government. Yes. When it's not run by the government, it's run by the cartels, the mafia. As such, there are neighborhoods that the government won't even enter because they know that if they go in, they're not coming out alive. Part of that problem is simple things like trash collection doesn't happen. So instead, the people just either burn the trash. Yes, we actually saw a whole bunch of people burning their trash, or they just keep throwing it in between the borders, and eventually somebody has to come fix it. But as we were traveling there on Monday, I couldn't help but notice a lot of the houses were missing doors and windows. And I asked Hannah why. She said, the people here are so poverty-struck that people steal everything, including doors and windows. And that was mind-boggling to me. We're not talking about theft on the street where somebody has a purse. We're not talking about the high-end theft that happens on Wall Street. It's simple, basic things that when there is no functional government, chaos reigns. You could do whatever you want. In fact, I think Rabbi shared it in the other class, but I'm going to share it with you. We went through, so after the border, we were going to the fish market, and we went through what looked like a booth to get onto a bridge, and they were collecting money. And Michael says to us, they're really not allowed to be collecting the money. Why? It's similar to here in Coronado, for those of you who are familiar. They would collect money at the booth until the bridge was paid off. Now that the bridge was paid off, you don't have to pay. Now, me as the New Yorker, never heard of such a concept in my life. Where's paying for the George Washington Bridge? Every single time you look at it, $13 when you get on, $13 when you come back. It doesn't matter if the bridge was paid for or not paid for. But the concept was the bridge was paid for. Now we don't have to collect taxes, right? That's in Coronado. So the same concept was what they tried to apply in Tijuana over this bridge. The problem is there was a group of people who said, if there's a booth and we could stop cars, why shouldn't we collect? So he said the moment the government officials come, specifically the soldiers, all the people in the booths just disappear. They run away. Why? Because they're doing it illegally. They're not allowed to be taking the money. But you, as the person passing the bridge, when they say highway robbery, that's exactly what it is. There are people sitting in the booths. You must pay them. If you don't pay them, you don't get to go on the bridge. But these people don't work for the government. It was so comical had it not been so sad. And you're looking at, again, a world which is not hundreds of years ago. We're talking about today, where when there isn't a strong centralized government, there will always be a vacuum of power. And when there's a vacuum of power, it's not the best that makes it to the top. It's might, not right, that gets you to the ruling. I want to read to you from a book written by Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes was one of the early political philosophers from England in the 1500s. After Machiavelli, so those of you familiar, Machiavelli was, I believe, a French philosopher who pushed for extreme to brutal forms of government because he felt that people left alone to their own devices are so destructive that unless there's a very strong authoritarian government, nothing's worth it. And the ideas born from Machiavelli's book are downright cruel and dangerous. Thomas Hobbes says something similar. His book is called The Leviathan, or The Leviathan, right? From the word Leviathan, the biggest of the fish. He wrote this book in 1651. I'm happy to send you a PDF I found, but there was a sentence I wanted to read to you. So firstly, the ideas of American democratic citizenship did not evolve entirely on the western side of the Atlantic Ocean, right? We know that. America's a baby in comparison to what was happening in Europe as far as the ideas, the philosophies, the ideologies that were born. We can see a profound influence from the political discussions taking place in Europe, particularly during the 17th and 18th centuries. Again, it's important to understand the context. The 16 and 1700s is, I'm going to give you history in 5 seconds. Yes? After the Roman Empire falls, from year 500 to 1500, you have what's called the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages, where Western Europe literally goes dark. They go back in time while the East is flourishing. So the Byzantine Empire, the Ottoman Empire, think of the Silk trade routes, the part of history they never teach you because the Europeans are the glory of civilization, and anything that comes from the East must be old and archaic and primitive. We're talking about thousands of years that while the European countries, the Western European countries, were living under feudalism with no centralized government, with horrible dictatorship from the Catholic Church, the East was flourishing. Yes, the East was flourishing, both the Muslim empires, the Indian, Chinese, the Middle East. What ends up happening is feudalism is, again, a system where there's decentralized government. The average person's terrified. Who's going to protect me? So you end up with a whole bunch of big lords who say, come live under my protection. In return, you lose all your freedoms. So he had a little fiefdom with all his serfs. They worked for him. In return, he protects them. And you have the nobles and the knights, the moats. Remember those castles and the moats and the princesses? That's where all these stories are born. Again, the reason we have the rise of feudalism is because there's no central government. That ends up falling with the Crusades, where they end up going from west to east saying, wow, there's a whole different world. There's a whole different way things can operate. 1600s, you have the scientific revolution. So Galileo, Newton, the rebellion against the church, where we're starting to replace theology and blind obedience with rationality, science. The scientific revolution leads to the industrial revolution. If you're familiar with the 1700s, you have two very different forms of government. One is capitalism, ultimately, and one becomes communism. They're born again from a place of, wow, now there's a whole world that we can conquer, that we can monopolize on. We can create, we can steal and pillage everybody's raw goods, the raw materials, create things and then force them to buy it back, all in the name of, we're building you up, we're making your civilization better by robbing you blind. Yeah. This is where the political ideas are then born of, how do we run an industry? How do we run an economy with industries? Should the government be involved? What does it look like? So that's where Thomas Hobbes' idea is born into. He says, this is a sentence I want to read to you. Hobbes grounds his political philosophy by exploring human nature. He argues that man is essentially motivated by a desire for self-preservation. In the end of the day, the most human force in a person is, I want to live. I want to survive. Without a powerful sovereign, the Leviathan, so without a powerful government to hold man in awe, we live in a constant state of war as we each struggle to protect our persons. In the end of the day, when push comes to shove, of course we could all be nice to each other, because we've never for one day experienced what it means to live in a famine where maybe we won't have a piece of bread tomorrow. Of course we could all be sweet neighbors until we're actually fighting over our territory and we're fearing for our life. Even the nicest people then become enemies. In essence, he says, life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Because ultimately we would be living in tremendous chaos and turmoil, fighting each other all the time to preserve our own lives. And that's when he proposes his idea of what he calls a social contract. What is the social contract? The social contract is people pledge their allegiance to a greater government, and in return, the government pledges its allegiance to making sure the people are taken care of, the people are protected, the vulnerable ones aren't exploited, the humanity isn't lost. That is the social contract between the individual and the government. There's a movie I've never watched. I don't even recommend you watch, but my students told me about it. They said it's called The Purge. The theory of the movie is that there's 24 hours of suspended law. So for 24 hours, nobody has to follow the law. And the movie's name is exactly what ends up happening, which is people end up becoming animals. People resort to, I need to preserve my own life, and I will do whatever it takes to get there. And yes, there are very nice and good people who come out of this. And unfortunately, there's a really ugly side to it. We see this ultimately with communism, right? The idea of Marxism, communism. There was a guy named Robert Owens. He was, I believe, Irish maybe, where he decided to take communism and try it out he named it New Harmony, Indiana, so here in the United States. And very soon after his colony was started, surprisingly, it became so corrupt that this utopian society of there's going to be a classless society, nobody's going to be over anybody else, we're all going to be equal, everybody's going to own everything, is very quickly self-destructed. Are there some ideas that may be good about communism? For sure, okay? Don't accuse me. This is not McCarthy's era. I'm not a communist. But are there some ideas about capitalism that are terrible? Of course. Of course. Yes. We don't have a perfect form of government on either side. Yet, obviously, we've seen the dangers on both ends of destruction, of what happens when there's a government that becomes a tyranny, of what happens when there's a government that becomes a tyranny because of its weakness. Both sides of that coin become deadly for humanity. I want to read to you a quote, and I'm going to end with that. It's called The Power Paradox by somebody named Keltner. He's a professor at, I think, UC Berkeley, if I'm not mistaken. Somebody current. So this is a pretty new book. He writes the power paradox, quote, is while we rise in power and make a difference in the world due to what is best about human nature, we fall in power due to what is worse. I'm going to read that again. While we rise in power and make a difference in the world due to what is best about human nature, we fall in power due to what is worse. What brings people usually to power? The fact that they're good, that they care, that they're kind, that they look at society and say, I want to make it better. And yet, unfortunately, when they encounter the power, all the things that they once stood for falls out the window. And that's when they lose the power that they just got because they become corrupt. Very often I look at leadership and I say, I can't believe somebody signed up for this job because they were bad. More likely, they were good once upon a time, and somewhere along the road, there was a pivotal moment where they made the wrong decision and went down the wrong track. And they went down, and maybe in the beginning it was a small infraction. It didn't even look different. But now 20, 30, 40 years later, look at where they ended up. Look at how horrible they've become. Look at how they, who were meant to replace that which was so corrupt and evil, that is what they've become. And again, I believe that anarchy isn't born in a vacuum. We're looking at a time period of the Shofetim, where the anarchy that rules brings out the ugliest side both on the religious corruption and on human corruption. The base morals of humanity are degraded in ways that I don't know other stories in our history that have been recorded that are similar to Pilegesh Begiva. Because we have a world of anarchy. We have a world where Ish Asher Hayashar Beinav Yaseh. What I see good and fit and right and fits my agenda, I get to do it. Why? Because there is no strong form of authority. There is no strong form of government to protect the vulnerable, to protect the weak. You have a government that is either corrupt because it's too strong or it's corrupt because it's ineffective. Either form of government is not doing its job. And I think I look today at a world where there's a lot we can learn, both on a Jewish level and then as a human, on a humanity level, where we keep responding to each other. So our Chachamim tell us, Yiftach bedoro, Kishmuel bedoro. Every generation and its leadership. I don't know which came first. Is it the generation that creates bad leadership, or is it the bad leadership that creates a corrupt generation? Maybe it's both. Maybe it's a little bit of each one. And really our job is to figure out in the context of, okay, so there is leadership. How do we push the leadership to be less corrupt? How do we push the leadership to be people who are honest, who are good, who are not just elected by the people for the people in our language, but are really there to protect those who need the most protection? Because when anarchy reigns, that isn't either the solution. When there is no form of government, when there is no set of laws, when there is nobody to enforce it, the chaos that ensues isn't any better than the corrupt leadership. It's simply we're replacing one evil with another. And I'm saying, so then we have to go back to the drawing board. We have to go back and say, we want neither. We're not willing to settle for bad leadership. We're also not willing to settle for a world of chaos. And you look at the Jewish world, the amount of chaos just in the world, in the religious capacity, is incredulous. It's incredible. We could stay here for hours talking about, under the guise of Judaism and leadership, what kind of atrocities get committed towards the constituents. We touched a little bit on conversion. It's not even the tip of an iceberg that we talked about. And yet the flip side is also true. The anarchy of, okay, so now everybody does whatever they want. No, there are no rules. We don't have to listen to anything or anybody or anyone. It's a reaction. But usually revolutions, they're there to solve one problem, but they bring along with them that many more problems. And our job is to figure out how do we push for better leadership? How do we push for better people who deserve better leadership? Because I believe ultimately a world that combines the two, that combines both the individual side of people need to be respected, cared for, listened to, heard, as well as centralized authority, and whatever that looks like. Okay, so every country and every state obviously has developed its own idea of how much power, how little power, what does the breakdown look like. My hope is as a Jewish nation, we've gone through and we are going through tremendous chaos. And my hope is that we will use this opportunity to look at our structures that sometimes they've been in place for so long that we're afraid to reevaluate them. Sometimes people are in bad relationships and they're so afraid to get out because they're in it for so long. And whereas we didn't ask for this earthquake, we didn't ask for this avalanche to hit us, the fact that we're now living through it actually gives us an opportunity to rethink things that for years have been so solidly stuck. Because if we're anyway living through this much chaos, we might as well use it to our advantage. We might as well use it to say, hey, hold on. If it hasn't worked for 75 years, now's our opportunity to voice our dissent. Now's our opportunity to say, I think differently. I have different ideas. I have different models. And I, as an individual, am allowed to push for those changes. And Bezrat Hashem, I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that together we will be able to first create a better, more wholesome Jewish world, and then ultimately inspire that model to the rest of the world. A world where there's leadership that cares, that loves, that is concerned about the smallest of its constituents, so that the human being and humanity isn't lost in the glorification of the sovereign.